Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, our fifth episode of the Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar, brought to you by the Electric Vehicle Society. We hold this webinar on the first Tuesday of each month, and it's our goal to examine a broad range of electric vehicle-related topics from a Canadian perspective. My name is Tim Burrows, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Electric Vehicle Society is a national Canadian organization whose goal is to leverage the expertise of vehicle owners and enthusiasts to help Canadians transition to electric transportation through education and through advocacy. Associate membership is always free at EV Society, but it would help us greatly if you could consider a full membership. Full membership only costs $30 a year, and a senior's rate is available at just $20 a year. If you're interested in learning more about electric vehicles and interacting with fellow enthusiasts, we invite you to join at one of our free chapter meetings held every month via video conference. Today's webinar is being recorded for later viewing and on the EV Society YouTube channel. Just search YouTube for Electric Vehicle Society. Watch and listen to past webinars, and please be sure to subscribe. Today's webinar will run for no longer than 60 minutes. All guests have joined today's webinar with their microphones muted. We invite you to ask our guest speaker questions at any time using the webinar's Q&A function. One of our webinar team members, Jason Arnaud, will read out your questions immediately following the presentation. Be sure to use the Q&A feature and not the chat function if you wish our panel to see your questions. The chat entries will not be seen by the panel or used to receive any questions. In addition to posting questions in Q&A, you may upvote any question that you see there that interests you by simply clicking the thumbs up icon in the same way you would like something in social media. By doing this, you raise the priority of that question to the top of the list, and it will make it easier for Jason to address the most thought-provoking questions. Before I introduce today's speaker, we invite you to participate in a short poll. This month, we're asking the following question: how should government funding to accelerate electrification be allocated? I'll launch that poll and ask you to consider the questions shown. When you're ready, please click up to 2 answers and then hit submit, and we'll see how the room is feeling. 90%. Just another few seconds. And I think we've got just about everybody. Not bad, 93%. So I'm going to end 95%. I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to flip it around and share the results with the room. So where is the best place for that money to be spent in order to effectively accelerate electrification? Here's how the room feels. Looks like number 1 is the building out the charging infrastructure. 56% of the room felt that was the most important thing to do with that money. The second most important, which is almost the other half of the room, it seems, saying that rebates for consumers purchasing EVs would be a great place to spend that money. Kind of not surprising, perhaps. Education, EV awareness and education, 21%. Industry, towards industry manufacturing of vehicles and perhaps subsidizing that industry, only 16%. Research on batteries and other EV-related, 8%. And finally, public transit, so things like electric buses and so on, 27%, so a good number there. So very interesting. And I know that we have a room full of keen people who are very tuned into this subject, so appreciate you sharing your responses with us. So today's webinar is entitled Impact of Charging Habits on EV Battery Health, and we're really lucky to have with us this month Charlotte Argue, who is the Senior Manager, Fleet Electrification at Geotab. Charlotte enables EV uptake for industry through data-driven fleet management software. Charlotte will take us through an introduction of battery degradation and provide a summary of Geotab's analysis of the battery health of some 6,300 electric vehicles. Hey, Charlotte, welcome to the webinar. Great to have you here all the way from beautiful British Columbia.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim, for inviting me to this series.
We're lucky to have you. I'm just going to jump in here, turn the microphone over to you, get out of your way, and let you do your presentation.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So I thought I would start this presentation by kind of prefacing it by mentioning that I'm not a battery scientist or physicist. So my background is in environmental sciences, and prior to joining Geotab, I led the Plug-in BC initiative at the Fraser Basin Council. There I managed several EV and charging station related programs to help accelerate EV uptake in BC. So I've worked in the EV industry for a little over a decade now, but not specifically on batteries. So I'm already anticipating that you're going to have some questions that I may not have the answers to, and I probably have some of the same questions as you. So this is your fair warning. But what I will be able to provide you with is, in addition to an overview of battery degradation and why it happens, what I'm excited to share with you is what we've learned to date about battery life from monitoring vehicles in the real world. So just looking at the last 7-8 years, so in some cases up to 9 years of batteries on the road, how have they been faring? As Tim mentioned, we've got over 6,000 vehicles that we've looked at. So hopefully this will give you a bit of a better understanding of what to expect with your own EV and potentially some things that you might want to avoid. Great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of telematics or Geotab, I essentially work in part of the connected vehicle industry. And what we do is we take data from vehicles, whether they're electric or diesel or other, and we turn that data into insight. So our main customer, or we mainly cater to fleet operators and fleet clients. So essentially bringing vehicle side data into an online platform, providing that to the fleet manager so that they have insights to better optimize their own operations. And Geotab itself, it's headquartered in Oakville, so we are a Canadian company, but we do operate globally. And in 2018, some of you might be familiar with the company Fleet Karma, which is a Waterloo-based company. But in 2018, Geotab acquired Fleet Karma. So we've got a world-class team who've been working on EVs for many years now. And part of my role at Geotab is, in addition to kind of acting as a subject matter expert on fleet electrification, I'm here to help translate some of the insights and areas that our data can tell us and share that with the EV industry at large. So I'm excited to share some of that with you today. So I thought we'd start with a little bit about just what battery degradation is. So it's the irreversible loss of the ability of a battery to store energy and to accept or deliver power. Now, from the EV driver perspective, what we really care about is this ability to store energy, because that has a direct impact on our vehicle's range. With regards to accepting and delivering power, this is more related to the battery's internal resistance. And as far as your own vehicle performance, an increased resistance and its ability to deliver power isn't going to have an observable impact on your vehicle's performance, because these batteries and these motors have more than enough. They've got power to spare, essentially. Although over time, what this might impact is the efficiency of your vehicle overall, and potentially how long it takes to charge on a fast charge. But I just wanted to mention that for all intents and purposes for this conversation, we're really going to be focusing on the battery's ability to store energy and the storage capacity of the vehicles. So degradation can be represented as a vehicle's state of health, which is measured in percentage. So when you buy an electric vehicle new, let's say it has a 60 kilowatt hour battery pack, it's going to have 100% state of health, meaning that it can store that much energy. But then over time, you're gonna see a degradation or a loss in the ability of that battery to hold that much energy. So I've included a typical degradation curve here for you. And this is just to show you that theoretically, but also scientifically, for lithium ion batteries, it's not exactly a linear degradation that these batteries see, although it is a natural process. They typically will have an initial steep decline called the stabilization period. And then after that, it's followed by a long period of time that's more or less linear degradation. And it ends with this steep drop off. Some people call this the knee or the heel, point of no return, the doom. Essentially, at that point, what's happening in the battery is there are a number of feedback loops that just brings it to a point of no return, and the acceleration or the degradation rates accelerates quite quickly after that. So I mentioned degradation, it's a natural process, but what causes battery degradation? So here I've listed the seven, let's call them the seven main culprits of degradation. And these are time. So for time, regardless of what you do, even if the battery's just sitting there not being used, it's still gonna degrade. And then the next one is high temperature, then high state of charge, time spent at low state of charge, high current, low temperature, and then the number of energy cycles the battery has. So as it gets a little bit more complicated on why these seven factors cause battery degradation, because there are several different mechanisms that they impact and they cause within the battery chemistry. So I've listed some of those here. This can include mechanical stress or cracking, and this can be from expansion and contraction of the battery, either from heat or from high energy cycles. It could include a buildup of the SEI, which is that kind of protective of the solid electrolyte interface. It includes decomposition of various materials within the battery and a number of other things. And I've actually included this link in this little screenshot here because I found this video to be really interesting for anyone who's watching this and are interested in kind of the pathways of how each of these factors cause different types of degradation and what mechanisms they're impacting. I recommend you taking a look at this YouTube channel and look up the battery degradation scientifically explained, because they'll go through that in a lot more detail. All right, so from Geotab's perspective, we didn't really want to know what the mechanics are of battery degradation. What we wanted to know is what's happening in the real world. So how are EV batteries faring from the vehicles that have actually been on the road, and what can we see about their degradation rates? And from that, we really wanted to understand, is this something to be concerned about? And is it impacted, is degradation rate the same across all EV makes and models, or does it differ across different models? And then is there anything we can see in terms of the correlation between external factors that might impact that rate of degradation? So can we see anything around the usage or how many kilometers these vehicles are traveling? Does it matter what kind of climate the vehicles are in? And then key to this presentation, the charging type and charging habits. So does that impact degradation rates? And then from all that information, really the key thing we're trying to solve is, do EV operators need to know anything about this? And is there anything that they should be concerned about, and or is there anything that they can do to limit degradation? So I want to just touch on the methodology of how we got the data, because with EVs, you can't just simply plug in a device and read a common signal across all EV makes and models to tell you what its state of health is. So we won't just say, oh, hey, my state of health right now is X%. So we really needed a way to measure the observable health of these batteries. So the method that we used was looking at charging events, and we have kind of a sophisticated threshold of what charging events will include or count within within our data analysis, but essentially for those that pass that threshold, we look at the energy that comes into the battery in kilowatt hours and divide that by the change in the state of charge percent of the battery, which is the signal you can get off of the vehicles. And that gives you an estimate of the current capacity. So if you take that and you divide by the vehicle's starting battery capacity, so the battery capacity at new, that'll give you the percent, the state of health for that vehicle. And then if you think about it, if you're looking at, let's say we just look at the last month of charges and get an estimate for any given vehicle, and then do the same thing with the month prior to that and the month prior, you can start plotting out a degradation curve for those vehicles. What we also did is we were able to take those kind of monthly means for all the vehicles out there and then group them by make, model, year, so we can start comparing different makes and models. So as mentioned, we had 6,300 vehicles that we analyzed. So this isn't a small pool by any means. And I believe it was 64 different make, model, years that we looked up. And that represented 1.8 million days of data. Okay, so what did we find? So putting all of those data points together, we found that the average degradation curve or rate across all vehicles was only 2.3% per year, which arguably is quite minor. We expected it might have been more, but we were pleased to see that was only 2.3%. And what we did was we took the average degradation curve by vehicle type, and we plotted that and developed a public-facing tool. So you can actually go in and use this tool and select the vehicle of choice that you're interested in and see how it compares to the average degradation rate. So I'm not going to go spend time playing with this tool for you. I've left a link there, or if you just Google it, Geotab degradation tool, you can find it yourselves. And yeah, feel free to play with this tool. So as I mentioned, we also wanted to see if there was any correlation with external factors on how degradation rates was impacted. So this might have been actually the most surprising result that we've found, which is that the usage didn't have much impact at all, almost negligible in terms of degradation rate. So to do this, what we did is we looked at vehicles, all the vehicles that traveled on average less than 8,000 kilometers a year, and then we compared that with all the vehicles in our system that traveled more than 20,000 kilometers per year. And as you can see, this is the result. So there is a little bit of a noticeable difference between high use and low use. But really what this tells us is, and this is why it's surprising, is because we know energy cycles is meant to increase the rate of degradation, but within the realm of what people would normally drive from a low use to a high use, it's not enough to actually have substantial impact on your degradation, which is really good news for fleets. It's probably good news for you as well. It means that you shouldn't be scared of using your EV. The next one we looked at was climate types and whether climate had an impact. And so for this one, we were able to measure the average trip temperature. So we're able to pull trip temperature off of our devices as well. So we could group vehicles into different climate categories. So what we did was we looked at hot climate, which we define that as more than 5 days per year, where these vehicles were driving in days that were over 27 degrees Celsius. And then we pulled out what we call the temperate climate group for vehicles that weren't exposed to hot or cold. So they were fewer than 5 days over 27 degrees Celsius, and they were fewer than 5 days under -5 degrees Celsius. And yeah, you can see it's quite obvious the difference between degradation rates where there's a noticeable impact. I will mention that the dark line, so that steeper line in hot climates, that's actually not that much worse than what our overall average was. So it's not much worse than 2.3%. And what we're really looking at is for those vehicles in temperate climates, they perform much better than average. And so that's just partly because of the skew of the data. Most of our vehicles were in North America, so a lot of them were exposed to multiple temperatures over the 4 seasons. But that's probably the biggest takeaway for this one. Okay, so this is kind of the topic of today, which is charging habits. So if you think about charging habits, charging kind of touches on several of the 7 root causes of battery degradation. So 4 of the 7 can be impacted by how you charge. A high temperature, the higher the power station that you're using, the more likely it's going to have higher temperature impacts is going to cause heat within the battery. With high state of charge, this is how often you fill your vehicle completely up and how long you let it sit there at, say, 100% state of charge. And then low state of charge, same thing, how empty do you let it go? And then with high currents, what is your typical method of charging? So obviously, the higher power the station, the higher current you're going to be exposing your battery to. So let's first look at the choice of charging stations. So that's the high temperature and high current impacts or root causes. Okay, so first we wanted to know whether or not there was a difference between drivers who typically use the level 1 charging station, which is your typical your regular outlet in North America, 110, 120 volt, versus level 2, which is the 240 volt or the level 2 station, which some people have at their home, or some people primarily use their stations at work. And looking at those 2 groups, we really didn't see a significant difference between degradation rates. You can see a little bit of a deviation with those 2 lines. The difference isn't outside of the margins of error. I have heard over the years that level 2 can be better for batteries because automakers and the manufacturers essentially designed to be the most efficient for level 2, because that's what they expect people to use. So they optimize it for them, but we really didn't see any concrete evidence of that. So, I mean, that's good news. It shouldn't really matter if you use level 1 or level 2 in terms of your overall long-term health of your battery. So this is probably the scariest slide I have, because looking at DC fast charging, it's another story. So let's, there's a very obvious trend here. So I'm going to walk you through what we're looking at here. So first of all, the lines kind of in order from top to bottom. First, we're looking at groups of individuals who never fast charge at all. And then the gray line in the middle, that's for those who charge up to 3 times a month. And this bottom one in gold is for those who charge more than 3 times a month. And yeah, you can see a definite trend here. A couple of caveats for this. So first of all, we essentially what we're trying to do when we're grouping vehicles to see what the impact of these factors are is we need to try to hold the other factors as constant as possible. So what we did was we only looked at the vehicles that were operating in the hot climates. So essentially the worst case scenario for temperature, and then of those, how does DC fast charging impact? We didn't feel like we had sufficient data where we were comfortable showing the same thing for the temperate climates. So it's kind of still, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to you on how DC fast charging impacts people in milder climates or maybe in colder climates, but that's what you're looking at here. And I guess the other caveat for this is we're trending to, for the vehicles that are showing data points that are more than like towards the end of this chart, and this is the same comment for all of the charts that we've been looking at, they have had to be more than 3 or 4 years old. So we are looking at slightly older generation vehicle models to input this chart. So I just wanted to say that so that it doesn't overly concern you and you don't jump to conclusions that, okay, absolutely DC fast charging is bad for me and I can't use it, because there are some caveats here with this chart. But it still was surprising on how well it seemed to correlate. Okay, so now let's touch on the impact of high state of charge and low state of charge. So for these ones, unfortunately, with the way we can analyze the data, we weren't able to really look at the impact of those who choose to always let their vehicle go up to 100% versus those who, I know in a lot of vehicles, you can say what percent you want the vehicle to stop charging at. And partly the reason why it was complicated and why we couldn't do it is because of how buffers work within these vehicles. So I'll just give you a little diagram to explain this, and also just give you a little bit of a better understanding of how state of charge really works. So if we imagine that this column is your vehicle's battery, what you as the EV driver have access to is not the entire battery. When your vehicle says you're at 0% state of charge, you're actually at that line between C and D. And when you're at 100% state of charge, you're at that line between A and B. So for practical reasons, this is your 0 to 100 state of charge, and this is what you have access to. But what automakers and battery manufacturers do is they create these top and bottom buffers to protect both you and the battery from accessing it. So you have no way to access this portion of the battery. But we also don't necessarily know how big that buffer, that A and D buffer are. So for us to understand truly what 100% state of charge means or 80% state of charge means for your vehicle, we need to know what that buffer is. And each manufacturer might have a different buffer. So the size of the A and the D buffers might be different across vehicle make, models, and years. And the very interesting thing about this is that these buffers can change over time. So some manufacturers, I'm not sure if all of them do it yet, but certainly several automakers have the ability to do firmware updates where they'll actually change how big that A and that D size is. So for example, an automaker might say, after you hit the 4-year mark of your vehicle, you have natural degradation where it's getting less and less. They might give you more access into those buffers so that your observable decrease in range is not as bad as what otherwise would be. Okay, so I wanted to touch on some other tools that OEMs are using right now to protect you from battery degradation. So automakers and battery manufacturers, I would say they're just as concerned as you are about extending the life of the battery. So they do a number of things to try to prevent you or mitigate the impacts of battery degradation. So the first one I mentioned is those embedded state of charge buffers to protect you. But then there's also these firmware updates that they'll change over time. And then for the temperature protection, all vehicles have some sort of battery thermal management system in place to try to mitigate the impact of temperature. Some of them are more efficient or more effective than others. So some use air cooling, some of them use liquid cooling. But over time, these systems are getting better and better. And then another thing that automakers are doing are some of them have the ability to precondition or have an option to precondition those batteries so that if you're planning to head to a charging station, let's say you're in a Tesla, you select a supercharger that you're going to, you might see a little notice come up saying preconditioning battery. And that's the actual thermal management system of the battery pack itself, bringing the temperature either up or down to the ideal temperature, so it's more efficient to charge, and also has the minimal impact on the degradation. And then finally, I don't know how many billions of dollars have been going into battery chemistry and battery science. Many of you probably watched the Tesla battery days, but this is improving all the time. So what we know now about the vehicles that have been on the road for the last 5 to 8 years, that might not be the same for future vehicles in the future. OEMs or new vehicles that are coming to market. All right, so having said that, there's still some things that you can do to prevent or mitigate against battery degradation. So the first one we would say is, if you can and if you have the option, avoid DC fast charge use, particularly on hot days, because it seems to be the combination of hot climate and use of DC fast charge that is bad. And particularly if you have an older generation vehicle where you're already range limited. So that's probably the scenario where you want to avoid DC fast charging the most. Second one is, it's actually quite simple, but it can make a difference, is parking in the shade. So just less exposure to hot temperatures. An example, what we would say to a fleet manager if they're trying to site their stations, is if they have the option to put their EV parking and EV charging on the north side of the building, then that's probably better than if they put it on the south side of the building, for example. Another one, as mentioned, if you have the option to precondition batteries, not all vehicle models today have this option, but if you do, then use it. And then try to avoid charging to 100% state of charge, unless you're about to go on a long trip. But I would say the important piece on that is how long you let that car sit at 100% charge. So if you're about to go on a trip, on a drive, getting it to 100% and then going into the vehicle right away and going on your drive, that's not going to have much impact compared to, let's say you've come home from a trip, parked it, and you're not planning to take your car out again for another few days. That's probably the worst time to charge it to 100%. And the same thing for sitting at close to 0% state of charge. Although I have a feeling fewer people let their car get to 0 than get to 100. And then the last one, I didn't really talk about this yet, but several automakers will recommend this. So if you're in the midst of winter or in summer hot days, have a heat spell or something like that, they will recommend that you keep the car plugged in. So not charging, but just plugged in. And the reason for that is, while it's plugged in, if the temperatures start to drop really cold or get really hot, the battery thermal management system can kick in and just protect that battery from any adverse effects. Okay, and then the most important suggestion is not to panic. So just going back to our overall average degradation rate, for the vast majority of vehicles, these batteries should last longer than the cars. So you shouldn't be fearing. These batteries are also under warranty. So if for any reason your battery is degrading faster than expected, most of these automakers have 7 or 8 year warranties and certain mileage as well. So just don't want you to go home and panic. Okay, this is when I'm going to do a time check just to see how we are, and it looks like we're still good for time. So I'm going to touch on another analysis tool that we did this year. And similar to the battery degradation tool, we looked at how vehicles were performing. But in this case, what we wanted to answer is, how does temperature impact range? And I know this is a conversation, or this is a topic that comes up a lot. This is one of the things that people push back against for EVs is, oh, okay, they can't go anywhere in the winter because they don't have enough range. So what we wanted to do is really understand how much efficiency is lost in different temperatures, and try to get a better understanding of what one can expect and what one can do to mitigate the impact. So what we did was we looked at, again, several thousand vehicles, and essentially looked at the trip temperature and the trip efficiency, and plotted it on what's really an efficiency curve. But if you turn that into a range, you get a range curve. And surprisingly, regardless of the vehicle make and model, they all fit on this very nice, similar curve here. So this is what you're looking at here. This is the average across all different makes and models. But if you just take any one make and model and plot it on top, you're going to see pretty much the same curve. The big takeaway, I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to save time for questions, but for this one, the big takeaway is that we get the most efficient trips at the same temperature that humans are the most comfortable at. And this makes a lot of sense, and I'll explain why, but the most efficient trips were at about 21.5 degrees Celsius. And anything above or below, you lose range. And the reason is we don't like to be hot, we don't like to be cold, so we either crank that AC or we crank that heater. And these heating systems, or air cabin systems, they actually take quite a bit of energy. So you're essentially taking energy from the battery that otherwise would have been able to move the vehicle, and instead put it to heating the air around you. So there's the big recommendation that we had for this is preconditioning, preheating your vehicle if it's really cold or really hot outside, if you're already plugged in your garage, because that can improve the overall efficiency because you don't waste that extra energy. And then using the heated steering wheel, the heated seats, because that is also going to mitigate against range loss. We also turned this into a public tool, and this is available on our website as well. And I just wanted to mention that we've also just looked at the additive effects of battery degradation on top of the temperature impact on day-to-day range. So if you select your vehicle of choice and it's 4 years old already, click the account for battery degradation, then it'll take account the capacity loss that we expect you to have already had, and then take that and look at what efficiency you're likely to have at any given temperature. So that's another one to take a look at. Okay, and with that, I think we can move over to questions.
That's great, Charlotte. Thank you very much. I just, before I pass over to Jason, I thought I would just mention that that tool that Charlotte mentioned on Geotab's website lets you choose, of course, the make and model and year of quite a few EVs and see what the degradation curve looks like for that specific vehicle and year and model. But as she said, the batteries are outlasting the cars, even in the worst case scenarios. So it's really good news. And the other thing I just wanted to add, Charlotte, that I understand that tool that's on with the 6,300 cars on your website is meant to be a living tool, and that you're building the number of inputs and adding cars to it. And so that will just get to be an even more powerful tool for people to use. I believe that's correct?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, over time we hope to add, because we're definitely missing some makes and models from the tool, and we want to be able to track this over time as well.
Yeah, awesome. Jason, how about you take us through some questions here?
Thank you, Tim. We have a fifth question that just came in, so they're all coming in now. The first one touches on something you mentioned in one of your earlier slides. You said that there wasn't really enough data to talk about EV battery performance in the extreme cold. Are you aware of any studies that do look at EVs in the extreme cold, like we have to deal with in some parts of Canada? Yeah,
so I should explain that too. So what we were unable to do is isolate vehicles in just cold without having the heat impact the results. And so the reason why is because in most places in Canada, at least where the vehicles were, and US as well, where the vehicles were running, if they were exposed to cold weather, they were also exposed to hot weather. So we had the double impact for those. So we weren't able to isolate just cold, because what we were looking at is impact on those hot days as well. So that's what I meant by not being able to separate that group. There certainly have been quite a bit of studies on cold weather impact on vehicle performance. There's been a number of things on buses, and I know Norway has done a number of studies on cars as well. I don't know if there's been any on battery degradation specifically though. There may have, but I'm just not aware. I think most of them look at range.
Okay, thank you. Anecdotally, I have read that the Nissan Leaf is very popular in Alaska because it does better on those really cold days and they just don't break. Second one is battery thermal management built into EVs and generally automatically enabled, or do you have to turn it on before a charge?
No, you don't. There's no user interference with the battery thermal management. So that's just part of the construction, the design of the vehicle and the design of the battery. And it's essentially each automaker might have a slightly different way that they manage. So there might be a different engineering behind it. As I mentioned, some of them might be air cooled or forced air cooled. Some of them might be liquid cooled. But there's you don't have to press a button to set it. It automatically happens.
Okay. Trevor asks, I like to plug my EV in when it's at about 50% charge. Should I be waiting longer to plug it in?
No, you don't need to. So I don't want to answer anything that we haven't been able to prove one way or another by data. And as I mentioned, we weren't able to see what the effects are of different levels of state of charge. So all I can do is say what others recommend and what automakers recommend, which is kind of in between the 30% and 80% or 75%. But presumably the closer you are to the middle, the better. So if 50% works for you, I think that's fine. But if you don't always have the opportunity to charge when you're at 50 and it goes down lower, I don't think you should be concerned about that either.
Okay, great, thank you. Next one is, do you have data on how much sitting near zero affects batteries?
Yes, same answer. Yeah.
Okay. Avoid it if you can. Okay, this one, how do folks volunteer to track data for Geotab to publish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So so essentially the data that we have belongs to the operator. So whether it's an individual driver who's participated in a program of ours, or if it's a fleet vehicle, what we are able, so we're not able to share their specific data. What we are able to do is aggregate all the data that we have access to. So we have very firm kind of ethics and privacy requirements within Geotab, and so everything, any analysis that we do kind of has to meet those requirements.
Okay. Next one is, aren't we comparing apples to oranges when different makes and models have different battery temperature management?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good observation, and I think it's something that you have to keep in mind as well. So that's why we wanted to compare degradation rates of different models, and so that's why the degradation tool exists in that format. But the only thing we can say from grouping it into climate groups or grouping it into the types of charging station that you're using is the average. impact. So within that, you're right, in some cases, if thermal management, maybe heat or temperature isn't impacting it as much, you'll see the results of that in the tool itself to say, okay, we know that the average degradation is less, and therefore we can kind of make that correlation. So taking the two together, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It's some will have a stronger correlation with heat, for example, than others.
Okay, let's see. Leo asks, in the spring, summer, fall, I only plug in my Model 3 when the charge gets below 30% and then charge up to 80. Therefore, there are many days when the battery sits with no connection. This reduces the number of cycles on the battery. However, does this routine have any other benefits other than less cycles on the battery and the connector?
I think if by doing that because you said the spring and fall, right? Not the winter and summer?
Spring, summer, fall.
Spring, summer, fall. Yeah, I mean, if you're keeping it within that range, but when you do charge it, in order to avoid otherwise charging, you're using DC fast charging, then maybe, but no. And the other thing is, so this is the charge cycles. Like what we saw just correlated to usage is we didn't see a very strong correlation between charge cycles, so charges and discharges. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's any, there might be, but I can't concretely say yes or no.
Okay, great, thank you. This goes back to one of your earlier slides. Have you looked at different battery chemistries with regards to capacity loss behavior?
So that's something that we're doing in this next phase where we've started looking at of the ones we know which, like if they're using NMC or other lithium ion chemistries, if we can make any correlations between which ones are degrading. The challenge with that is they're also likely to use different thermal management systems. So it's going to be really hard to separate out just the impact of that chemistry. So I honestly don't know what we'll be able to say from the data we're looking at, but it is something that we flagged as well, and we're interested in trying to explore that more.
Great. I don't know if you've captured this data, but Dave asks, can you talk about battery failure rates in your data? So situations where batteries actually had to be replaced?
Yeah. So I really, really wanted to find a car that got into that heel part of the curve and, you know, that point of no return, and we just didn't have it. So, I mean, that's all I can say is from our data set, we haven't seen battery failure to that degree where the battery had to be replaced or had very significant degradation. I expect over time we'll start to see cases of that, but it just hasn't happened yet.
Okay. Jim asks, although cabin heating or cooling would affect range, was there any determination of the effect of battery temperature on range? For example, starting out in the morning with a battery at under 0 degrees C.
Yeah, so definitively from our data, it's another situation where we couldn't really separate out those two factors. What we could do is start looking at auxiliary load and make a correlation between that and the efficiency. So what efficiency draw is and what efficiency we're seeing from the vehicles. So by that, we can kind of make that jump to say, you know, the majority of your range loss is because of the auxiliary load, and it's going to be a very minor part from that. Because it is true, batteries will or can be more efficient in their perfect temperature, but that's what the battery management systems are there for. So it's, yeah, we were unable to really show that connection.
Okay, great. I'm just going to check in with Tim. How much more time do we have for Q&A, Tim?
You can go for another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Pino has a technical question. He says, is there any difference in cell voltage balancing between L1, L2, or DC fast charging? Does cell balancing effectiveness impact degradation?
That's a question I cannot answer, but I am interested in knowing, because we do pull a lot of data from these vehicles, and I know we do look at the voltage and difference, but the cell balancing, I have no idea if there's a way for us to be able to pull that data, but I'm going to add it to my list, but unfortunately I don't have an answer for you.
Okay, this is an interesting one, a bit of a behind the scenes question. Whose cars did you select for the study, and how did you get the data?
Yeah, so we're a telematics company. A lot of our data comes from the end customer who uses our telematics system, as I mentioned. The majority of the data for the EV, so Geotab has 2.some million vehicles that are connected, but of our EVs, and we were just looking at passenger cars for this just because that was the data we had access to at the time. Most of them were through some of we've had a number of utility programs with what was Fleet Karma. So it included people who participated in that, included a number of programs in the US as well.
So basically you're collecting data from clients that then consume the results of those analyses.
Exactly, yeah, and as I mentioned, so all of the clients have access to their own data, but when it comes to aggregated, we're not sharing any individuals' data. We can only do aggregated results.
Okay, great. I know that you showed a graph for this. I can't remember if it actually showed this level of detail. Adam asks, do you find rapid capacity fall off below 80% or another percentage?
Of state of health?
I think so. That's how I'm interpreting it.
We don't know because we haven't seen, so lithium, and I'd actually know, like probably there is I don't know what a battery physicist would say in terms of when that heal normally happens, but for us, we haven't seen that heal happen yet. So I don't know what percent of state of health it's likely to occur.
Okay. David asks, do you have any data on plug-in hybrids? These, moved on me. These generally have smaller batteries and are often run fully down.
Yeah, we did include plug-in hybrids in our battery degradation tool. So you can take a look at, we certainly have several in that tool that you can take a look at. You can compare their degradation rates. The Volt was an interesting one, if I'm recalling correctly, because it actually showed quite good performance, and that's partly because of the firmware update. So they were able to give more access to the batteries. So from the user perspective and from the capacity perspective, it actually performed fairly well, despite the fact that you're generally going to be taking it all the way down.
Okay, great. Bob asks, in winter, you said that the car should be plugged in so that internal systems can protect the battery. However, he's concerned that this will result in the battery charging up to 100%.
Yes, I have the same concern. So, and the same thing with summer. So I would only recommend this if you're, if you have the capacity to set your vehicle to only charge to 80%. So don't let it charge to 100, but then leave it plugged in.
Okay, great. There's a question about using a block heater, and I'll just quickly answer that. The equivalent of a block heater in a gasoline or diesel car is actually part of that battery management system. So most EVs have functionality to both heat and cool the battery as they see fit. You wouldn't need a separate block heater to make that happen. Next one is a question from David. Not all vehicles are in the tool yet, obviously new models. When do you expect to have the tool next updated?
I wish I had an answer to you. So I it would be a guess at this point. So we are working on it behind the scenes. We're working on bringing in, so I mentioned we have the fleet karma data. We also now have more data from our fleet side of the Geotab databases. So we're working on how we can bring that data into the tool. But unfortunately at this time, I don't have a timeline for you.
Okay, great. We have 2 left, but we're at time. So unless Tim gives me an extension, I'm going to stop here.
The other comment I wanted to make was that one of the great takeaways, Charlotte, I think if I understood your description, is that out of 6,300 electric vehicles, you've yet to see one wear out a battery.
Yep.
That's kind of a nice story. That's really nice. So what, should we check back in with you in what, 5 or 10 years? What do you think?
Yeah, maybe that should have been my hook.
Well, that's
yeah.
awesome. That's awesome. Well, thanks, Charlotte. This is great. I really appreciate you taking us through all that data from Geotab. We really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. Thanks, Jason, by the way. Great job on the Q&A. We really appreciate that. Maybe we'll have you back when we do get to the heel of that curve, Charlotte, and talk about it a little bit more. It'd be pretty interesting to hear, but we do really, really appreciate you coming.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. It was great. So we hope that everybody will come back for the next Canada Talks Cars webinar. It's going to be on November the 3rd. And of course, we're hearing more and more every day about new investments and commitments in the EV space. And enthusiasts like you all really are empowering the momentum to electrification. We hope that you found today's webinar informative and that it'll help continue the EV conversation and grow awareness. So everybody, thanks again. And until next time, do your best, stay healthy. And again, thanks for spending the time with us today. So that'll wrap our webinar. Thanks, folks.